It's very difficult to gauge what individuals choose to expect from characters. If we're taking a look at off-field DPSs, let's look at the 4 stars for instance, and I mean the staple ones, that being Xingqiu, Fischl, and so on. They're incredibly versatile, strong, and they've held their value long term. But up until recently with Yelan, nobody's been able to contend with them. miHoYo isn't a direct side grade to Fischl. So keeping that in mind, they're not really comparable to anybody in the game's current state. And as we've seen with the release of 5 stars, and as I've talked about in my previous video if you've watched it already, there hasn't necessarily been a consistent track record among them. I mentioned earlier Ganyu, Hu Tao, and Xiao. And while to a degree these were the premier premium 5-star damage dealers, and we did get some more along the way such as Raiden or Ayaka, there was never that real consistency there that should have been. And so as a result, over time we've seen a steady decline or at least rapid change in the quality of 5 stars, or essentially future impact, in that a lot of the 5 stars released are released in a poor or at least mediocre state to a point to where they require artifact sets added later on, supports, or in some cases entire elements to be added. For instance, an example could be somebody like Eula or Kokomi. Whilst these are 2 dramatically different characters with dramatically different roles, both of them kind of suffered from similar things. And we'll also throw in Yoimiya in there as well. Kokomi was released with negative 100% crit rates, which really didn't even out. Then she had to have an artifact set added in later on to assist her in being more viable and more worthwhile to grab and use. On top of that, because corrosion was a thing but was never really essential or featured often in the Abyss, she was never really used for that reason in particular. She was used in the Morgana team, or at least in freeze teams in general, for Ayaka specifically because Ayaka's burst is incredibly reliant on the opponents being frozen. However, as more and more unfreezable boss enemies were added, that sort of declined in value, and then she found more value in Dendro. And while as a healer, Kokomi is incredibly good, she's also incredibly reliant on whatever is occurring outside to be good. She can heal, but she also has other competition in the healer slot. You could use a Jean who burst heals your entire party in an instant. You could use Yao Yao, Bennett, Diona, and so on. This means that to make Kokomi a valuable limited 5-star summon, she needs to either be good in a specific sort of team or reaction. Freeze was formerly that, instead now it's Hyper Bloom. If we're talking about the other characters, Eula is an example of a character who's waited forever for a dedicated support. She got a slight buff with somebody like Raiden, but physical damage as a whole has been sort of left in the dust. And Mika is just now being added even though it's not even her rerun. Yoimiya suffered the same thing. She was a character who was released without a really good dedicated support. Instead, she had to have Yunjin added in much later on to actually support her at C6. Meanwhile, we have characters like Kuki, characters like Kandake, Dori, Kale, even to a degree. And while there are many more, the main thing I'm seeing here, and the main thing I want to get across here, is that units are not consistent. Ayato realistically should be the baseline for a good main DPS unit. At least for 5 stars, and even 4 stars have seen a rapid decline or jump in value. You could have a great 4-star released right after a horrible one. And I understand the intention, to not power creep the original 4 stars or to not power creep any others, but at this stage in the game we kind of do need to consider that because the staple 4 stars Xingqiu, Zhang Ling, Sucrose, and Bennett have been so good for so long without any competition that it's no viable reason, and there is no viable reason, at least in the current state of the game, to pull for any other 4-star that doesn't directly replace them. Meanwhile, for 5 stars, we have characters in the standard banner: Tignari, Mona, Jean, Diluc, Keqing, Chi-Chi, and now Dea. I mentioned in the previous video that Dea isn't exactly a great unit, but I also want to mention more so that the standard banner units and standard in general doesn't necessarily have any consistency in terms of how powerful or how good a unit is. Diluc, Mona, and a lot of the original standard characters were great when the game first launched, and some of them have held their value. Jean is still an amazing healer that offers Viridescent Shred if you want her to. But Dea is an outlier in terms of what she does and how good she is, or at least how Constellation dependent she is. We've seen an uptick in Constellation value. After Inazuma, C2 is kind of the milestone you want to hit for most characters. As a result of this, we've seen characters in a lot of scenarios have value or their potential locked behind their Constellation. Yaimiko has energy recharge problems unless you have her C1. Meanwhile, you have so many units like Sino, for instance, or Nilo, who are incredibly reliant on other supports that are also soon to be released. Sino still doesn't necessarily have a proper aggravate support. Nilo needed Nahida to be extremely viable because of the amount of Dendro you need applied. And at the current stage, after Sumeru's release and after the immense amount of desert we've gotten, Doom posting, aside from Dea, hasn't necessarily been as common. It's more like you have a lot of individuals making a couple excuses or talking about how great a unit is. Wanderer is okay. Nahida is great, but we also need to consider Nahida herself is the only real off-field Dendro applicator. I've mentioned previously that Sumeru's 5 stars are incredibly restrictive in either the teams or the supports they want. Many of them want Dendro and only Dendro, and we haven't necessarily gotten enough Dendro to match that. And yet the complaints have sort of faltered. Daya had the most Doom posting in a while, whereas previously if a unit was considered mid, they were considered bad. And as of right now, Sumeru hasn't given us many mid units. They've given us bad units that are dependent on other units. Cyno, mid, but needs other units to actually reach his potential, otherwise don't use him, and I can say this as a Cyno haver. Wanderer, sure he was released with Faruzan, but he's also much more easily and much more viably knocked down, so he needs a bit more support to get running. Especially since, depending on how far away the enemies are, he doesn't necessarily have the AoE of somebody like Xiao, though he does have the advantage of floating, even though I still think he should have been Electro. I'll hide them, I don't have him, but he seemed good. Nilo, locked behind Bloom teams. And as for the 4 stars, you have Layla. I've mentioned a lot of these previously. Layla, Dori, Faruzan Kale, Candice, Yao Yao, and soon to be Mika along with Baijo and Kave. People are unhappy with Daya, and I understand that. I've played around with her. I'm not happy with her. A character being functional or usable isn't necessarily good enough considering they cost the same amount of primogems another unit could. And if we're talking about standard banner, Daya needs to at least be on par with the other standard units. Because either way, you've lost a 50-50 and you want that 50-50 loss to not feel awful. So it's a bit of a disappointment, to say the least. I am holding out hope that we get better units. I am holding out hope that we get better reactions or supports or anything in general to assist these characters. Maybe Geo gets buffed to the point where it's not as bad as it is now. However, Sumeru as a whole has not excited me any more than Inazuma did. At least Inazuma gave me people like Kokomi or somebody like Raiden. Sumeru has left me a bit disappointed. I got Cyno and was like, I don't want to have to use him in this specific team. I got Wanderer and was like, well, I mean, I could just use Xiao. Or Hazo. As a whole, Sumeru hasn't necessarily been exciting. A lot of the units have either been poorly designed in terms of the kit, or in my opinion, just poorly designed in terms of the outfit. So I'm hoping for better. I'm excited for Fontaine. I still want Lene in the future after all of this. But I do hope the expectations and the standards of units sort of raises. I want units to be good or at least viable. And not in a specific team, I mean viable for whatever field they do. Yelan was a perfect example of a unit that was a direct upgrade or at least comparable to a great unit that's already existing. But units like Kandake don't have a place as of right now, and I don't want characters to continuously release with plans for them to be good in the future. I want them to release and be good now, better in the future. We saw that a lot with the previous characters. Zhang Ling got better once we found National, and she's great in Melt. Fischl got better with Dendro, but she was good to begin with. I feel like it is unfair to release a character that is okay or bad now, such as Daya, and then say, oh, they'll get better in the future with a new artifact set, or oh, they'll get better in the future with this new item or this new character. Because it's asking you to summon for a unit with the hope that they do get better, and if they don't or don't get good enough, you will be disappointed otherwise. But what about your opinions? Do you regret pulling a character? I regret pulling Cyno. I like his design a lot. I like his, animations and his auto attacks. I just don't like what teams he's restricted to. Wanderer, he was an accidental summon. I don't really regret him, but I don't really like him. He's a gremlin. I do believe the banner scheduling is weird. Mika and Eula should have been around the same time, and Faruzan really should have been on Xiao's first banner when he was released with Yelan again. I mean, his first rerun, I suppose, or anything, considering she needs C6 to be extremely viable, or at least over Bennett. But those are my opinions. When you're watching this, I'll most likely have been in surgery or just gotten out, so I probably won't be able to record a bunch of brand new ones, so I apologize if the information here is a bit outdated. Either way, see you next time. Goodbye.